Hello and welcome at the World in Focus.
Dzień dobry, serdecznie witamy na Świecie pod lupą.
Świat pod lupą to seria debat o aktualnych wyzwaniach polityki międzynarodowej.
Wraz z wybitnymi ekspertami i ekspertkami przyjrzymy się, co czeka Europę i Polskę w zmieniającym się świecie.
Więcej na naszej stronie internetowej.
A teraz zapraszamy na kolejną dyskusję.
Will you show me when we start?
Start now.
Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na
Good
debacie.
afternoon. Welcome to a debate entitled How Borders of Europe, How to Reconcile Values with the Need for Control, organized under the World in Focus, staged by Heinrich Böll Foundation. The entire world is dealing with the COVID pandemic right now, but migrants are still arriving in Europe. We've witnessed the tragic fire of the Moria camp, and this has shown us that the issue is still burning. Lots of people were left without roof over their head, and although it's already a long time since the beginning of the migrant crisis, but still there is no idea as to how to resolve the crisis. Today we will meet Gerald Knaus, who's the founding chairman of the European Stability Initiative, and Kristian Brakel, who's foreign policy analyst on Middle East and Turkey, and head of office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Turkey. My name is Kaja, Puto, and I'll have the pleasure to moderate this meeting. I hope there are lots of viewers on Facebook and viewers. I would like to encourage all of you to ask questions. The first question will be addressed to both panelists, and it will regard the so-called flexible solidarity. It seems to be an euphemism which appeared in the project of new migration policy announced by Ursula von der Leyen in September. This is the first comprehensive bill concerning European migrant policy, which assumes, among other things, that countries, what we mean are Middle and Central Eastern Europe countries, which are not in favor of redistribution of migrants into their countries, can show their solidarity in a different way by deporting migrants. Well, I have to admit that as a representative of a liberal part of the Polish society, this proposal hurt me because I think it is as if we knelt down in front of Western European populists who claim they've won and that the European Union has done what they always wanted. So I wanted to ask about your opinion concerning this element and in general, the entire concept of the new migration policy, and whether the fear against the strengthening of radical populism should be its priority. Gerald, your turn.
Well, thanks a lot, Kaja. Thanks to the organizers for this opportunity, and thanks to everyone who's watching. This is, as you say, a burning, unresolved issue, but we should be clear about what the problem is. It is not that a large number of people are crossing to Europe irregularly. The numbers in 2018, in 2019, in the first half of 2020, and now are actually rather low. The total number of people crossing the whole Mediterranean in the last 2 full years was just above 100,000 people. If we would be able to determine fairly and quickly who among those who come needs protection, and if we would be able to return those who do not need protection to their country of origin or to a safe country of transit, which is in line with the Refugee Convention. And the question is how we do that. But if we would be able to do that, then the total number of people who get protection, who cross into Europe irregularly in the last few years would have been a few 10,000 for the whole of the continent. Now, the question then is, was it worthwhile in the last 5 years in Europe to focus above all on the question how you distribute those few 10,000 people? Is that really a very smart way to discuss the issue? Because what we see today at the borders, despite the fact that it's very few people who cross, is a complete absence of the rule of law. We are violating every European principle. And it's not Polish or Hungarian police that are violating them. These violations are happening in the central Mediterranean, in the eastern Mediterranean, on the Croatian-Bosnian border. So if you ask about solidarity, I think the key question, and I speak from Berlin at the moment, is that in every society, let's take Germany, politicians representing the public and the political elite has to decide what it wants to see. If Germans decide that they want to have the rule of law at our common European borders, that they want to help refugees and not see the Refugee Convention die, well, they can, and other countries that think like this together, can say, well, let's do something. Let's take recognized refugees from Greece or Malta or Italy. Let's set up these fast asylum procedures together. Let's negotiate with countries to whom to return those not in need of protection. And I would argue that Germany and France together, only those two, and there would be more who would join them, have an interest to do this all by themselves, together with the countries most concerned, Greece, Italy, Malta, and Spain, even if nobody takes part. Why? Because it reduces irregular migration of those who do not need protection, less people die, and central values, the right to asylum, the dignity of anybody who reaches Europe, sea rescues, central values are protected. Now, ideally, everybody takes part, but the whole debate started in the wrong direction when we said it only makes sense to act with 27. Well, why? Poland, I think a lot of Poles go to church on Sunday still, perhaps more than in Germany. They know the story of the Good Samaritan who walks past and sees this man in pain lying by the side of the road. And the story in the Bible is he goes and helps. And two other people before have walked past this man and didn't help. Well, the story is that if you feel you want to help for moral, political, legal reasons, you do it. The Good Samaritan didn't say, hey, that priest who walked past, I will only help if he comes back. And I'm convinced that this is the only way we can get to a state of legality on our borders. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have some things everybody participates in. I think it would make a lot of sense to have a system in Europe, like in Canada, with resettlement of recognized refugees, where 2/3, 20,000 people each year, are brought to Canada through sponsorships, where churches, associations, citizens, cities can say, we want to help, we want to take care of a refugee, apply to the Canadian government. The Canadian government has a ceiling, and then the refugees are brought in legally without smugglers, and integration works because there is a network to help them. This would be a very good system for Europe. Create a European fund that financially supports this. But then those countries that want to take part, everybody pays in, but those countries that want to take part, I would hope Poland would be part of it, but that's an internal Polish debate. You can't force Poland, but you can have Polish citizens make the case that it would be honorable and useful and good to take part. And then in Poland, you can say, are there cities, are there parishes, churches, are there citizens who say, we want to help refugees? The government sets a ceiling. In Canada, it's 0.05% of the population. at this moment, 20,000. You can do the calculation for Poland, how much it would be. Then we would have a system. I think this is the way we should discuss this. We shouldn't wait for the lowest common denominator for an agreement of everyone. Those who care about the Refugee Convention should go ahead and make the case that everyone has an interest and a moral obligation to help. But they shouldn't wait.
Chciałabym jeszcze dopytać o te możliwości.
I just wanted to ask about the possibilities concerning the activities taken not at the government level, because in case of Poland, mayors of 12 large cities signed a declaration where they are against the migration policy of the Polish government, and they declare the willingness to help and accept migrants. But after numerous debates with the government, they claim that actually it's not possible if the government is against, if the government doesn't allow action to be taken at local level, at municipality level. Do you think they're lying? Do you think there are instruments which would make it possible to cooperate with organizations, with the churches, with the municipalities? Because this is part of the new migration policy, but without any details given.
Well, I think, and this we see in Canada, but we see it in the German debate, it is not possible to do this if the central government does not agree to the framework. That's the same in Germany. Cities cannot bring in people without agreement by the government. But what is a bit strange is that there is empathy in a society, people who want to help. And then the central government sees that as a threat rather than as a good thing. Now, I think if some countries in Europe would go ahead, we've started a campaign here in Germany for a German-Canadian alliance to say globally, listen, societies that believe in the global refugee protection system should commit to create systems where citizens and civil society and cities can do what is done in Canada, a 0.05% project. And I am convinced if some countries in Europe move ahead, and if we create a European fund, the debate in Poland might change. It would be easier then for those cities, for those mayors to say, listen, the Germans do it, the Dutch do it, the French do it, who knows, the Slovaks do it. It's not forcing us to take refugees. The government sets a limit. People can see how it works, and it is controlled. In Canada, the government checks the health status, the security status, and it checks whether these are refugees. But it creates a framework for empathy. And I think that would allow the tension at the moment between those who want to help and those who say, no, nobody, nothing, that there could be a system that would overcome this tension. And that system, and that's where the flexible solidarity comes in, could be funded, at least in part, from European funds. So I think it's great that cities, they do it in Germany, they do it in Austria, and it's great that cities and mayors in Poland send the signal that they are willing to help. We now need a constructive system that allows governments to agree, because they say, listen, others agree too. We need to get away from the idea that people will be forced by a forced mechanism, which never works. I mean, that's the core problem I have with the whole idea of quotas. I mean, we had a system for now almost 2 decades of Dublin, which was supposedly about keeping people in certain countries. They never stayed there, and they could never be moved back there. You know, it never worked. Sweden had many more asylum applications than Italy, right? So people left Italy, where they might have had to stay, went to Sweden and stayed in Sweden or Germany. So forcing people somewhere in Europe doesn't work. But what could work is a positive example. And that's where I think pressure from below, sending a signal society is ready, is hugely helpful. But also a debate at the European level in different member states, like Germany, like Sweden, like France, and ideally countries like Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland, to take part in this. That should be a national decision that is also a belief in the dignity of human beings. It is really a core. It's not these resettlements and these sponsorships of refugees. They're not a left idea or a liberal idea or a right idea. They're just a humanistic idea. In the US, it was President Jimmy Carter who took a lot of refugees in from fleeing from communist Vietnam, but it was President Ronald Reagan who continued. The Americans took in hundreds of thousands of refugees. And in Canada, it's a program that's been in place for decades under conservative, liberal, center-left, center-right governments. It's very much supported by religious groups, church groups, but not only. There are also citizens, secular humanists who say we want to do something. We need a program where human natural empathy can be combined with control. And I think that's the topic of this debate today.
Dziękuję bardzo. Teraz chciałabym spytać Kristiana.
Thank you. And now the question goes to Kristian Brakel. What is your opinion on the new migration policy and this notion of flexible solidarity?
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes, of course, I'll try that. Can you hear me now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try my best. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think Gerald has already made some very good points, and I'll keep it brief because other than him, I'm also not an expert on refugee issues as such, but mostly on Turkey. I have mainly 3 points to make. One is to answer directly to your question on this euphemism of solidarity. I mean, of course, this is a total misuse of the word, and because the way that we understand solidarity, or I understand solidarity, is of course in helping those who need support and help the most. And in this case, it's definitely not those countries who are not willing to take those fleeing from war or other situations in. But of course, in this case, it would be supporting the governments that don't show willingness, which I think is like a very crude version of solidarity. But I think it's a good idea to come back to what Gerald said, and this idea of a framework of empathy, of solidarity, where we can employ this solidarity and look at what we really want and where we can apply more practical steps. And I think some of the suggestions that he made are quite good. I only have like 2 minor points where I'm not quite sure that for example, the Canadian example would work, but maybe.
We don't hear you now.
I'm not. Do you hear me at all? Hello?
Can you speak louder, or do you hear us at all?
I hear you. Do you hear me?
Not really.
Okay. Sorry, connection is bad.
Okay, now it seems better.
Okay, try again. Okay, so what I was saying is, like looking at Gerhard's suggestions, what I fear might be problematic are 2 points where this Canadian solution might be difficult for Europe, I would think. I mean, what you address, if I understood you correctly, is mainly the situation with refugees. But of course, not everyone, and you said that correctly, comes or tries to enter the EU as a refugee. But I mean, we have a lot of people who are trying to migrate into the EU, and which is also not something which might be in many ways it's done like by like crossing the Mediterranean, trying to walk through the Balkans, might be illegal in legal terms, but of course it is not necessarily illegitimate to try and go to a different country to seek a better fortune for you and your family, and also something that has happened for centuries. And the question is how Europe can find a common system, a common regulation to deal with that. Because this, even if you introduce quotas, and maybe also not only quotas for refugees, but quotas also for people who want to migrate to Europe, I'm not completely sure that those who would be rejected from entering the EU for whatever reasons, I don't know, if the EU doesn't deem their skills to be applicable to the labor market or for other reasons, that these people would automatically think, oh, okay, I didn't have a chance, so there is no reason to get onto a boat, or there is no reason to pay a smuggler. I mean, people can be desperate for various reasons, and these can be economic as well. And so I think we need a European solution as well, because also, and that's also maybe the second difference that we have to Canada. I mean, there's a whole ocean.
Okay, I'm sorry, Kristian, but we don't hear you again. Kristian, do you hear me? I'm sorry, but you cannot really hear you. So maybe you can pull over and find a place with a better connection, and we'll go back to that. Okay. Is it possible? Because with your hands up packets, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No. Try again.
Try again. I'm not sure what the last thing was that you.
Well, it will be better if you have your phone by your ear.
Okay.
So if you could pull over. Not really. Can you try to say something now?
Hello?
Hi. Yeah. Now it seems better.
Hello?
Hi. Yes. Now it's good. Can you repeat a few last sentences?
Okay. I'm not sure what the last thing was you heard me saying. So I was thinking that maybe there's this one last difference that Canada has that compared to the EU. That, I mean, Canadian borders are separated by two oceans from most of the countries where both refugees and migrants would come into the country, which of course makes it easier for people to come into the EU. And of course, so the problem might be a little bit different, even though I support Gerald's general idea of introducing quotas. Maybe I leave it by that, given that the connection is so bad.
Now it seems better. So if you can stay with your telephone like that, it would be great in the future. Gerald, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, 2 points. I mean, Kristian rightly said that some people who cross the Mediterranean are not refugees. So when we talk about irregular migration, not everyone who crosses will be recognized as a refugee. It's very important to remember a very basic fact. Anybody who crosses into Europe, to know if they are a refugee or not, you need a process. You need what we call an asylum system, which should be fair and apply the criteria which we have in our law and see, is that person in need of protection because of a warranted fear of persecution, right? So many who cross into Europe across the sea from the central Mediterranean, from North Africa, are not refugees, very likely. Tunisians, for example, is the biggest group this year. Very few Tunisians get refugee status in Europe. Now, my proposal for a Canadian solution for refugees, trying to bring in more in a regular procedure, does not mean that we don't also need a policy on other irregular migrants. And the policy on the others, I want to be very clear, they shouldn't come. You don't want irregular migrants to cross with little boats and smugglers. This is dangerous, and that's why we had thousands and thousands of deaths in the central Mediterranean of people from Nigeria, Senegal, Gambia, and other countries who in the end don't get refugee status. Our policy should be clear. Anybody who crosses irregularly, who is not recognized as a refugee, should be returned to stop irregular migration of those not in need of protection. That is in line with the Refugee Convention, that is in line with human rights law, it saves lives. There is no right to migration. There is a right to refugee protection.
Yeah, but the Refugee Convention seems to be a bit outdated. I mean, there will be more and more people migrating because of the climate crisis.
Not now. I mean, Tunisians don't migrate because of the climate change. And in any case, the numbers of people, if this argument means we don't need an asylum system, right? If we can't determine the criteria, Tunisians, Moroccans, we have in EU law 2 criteria. You know, the Refugee Convention, we also have subsidiary protection for people escaping from war who are in danger for their life. But if we give up on this, we give up on everything. Then Viktor Orban comes and says, we can't distinguish between migrants and refugees. And the conclusion is push everyone back. I mean, this is what's happening politically. So I very strongly believe it's a big mistake to give up on this conviction, on this distinction. If somebody from the Gambia comes, and I've talked to many Gambians, when there is now a democracy, it's a very poor country, but there is democracy. There are people who come irregularly through the Sahara, through Libya. They are tortured. They die in the desert. They die at sea. We should do everything possible to discourage this kind of migration. And Gambian civil society agrees on this. So what we then should do is find ways for legal mobility, but that is not a substitute for trying to say clearly, if you come to Europe and you don't need protection, you should be returned, because that's what kills thousands of people. But then we come to the difference with Canada. Canada doesn't have any ocean between the Canadian border and El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Colombia, Venezuela. You know, there are lots of refugees in Central America, in South America. In fact, there are fewer countries between Central America and Canada than between Turkey and Germany. There are many more countries between Germany. Germany is further away. And many of these are not Schengen borders, you know, in the Balkans. These are all international borders. So I don't think there is such a big difference. Canada also has a program for migrants. That's different. That's not for refugees. There they have very clear criteria, like Poland or Germany. When Poland says we need Ukrainian workers, this is not a refugee issue. That's an issue of the labor market. When Germany says we offer people from the Balkans, from Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, a chance to work, which is a very good program legally. But this is separate from refugees. So to sum up, I don't think there is a big difference. In Canada, also you can come in irregularly and apply for asylum. And every year, last year, 30,000 did, like in Germany. But we should try to discourage irregular arrivals. And we discourage them by helping refugees find a less dangerous way, either by supporting them where they are or by bringing them in through resettlement. Discouraging those who are not refugees from coming by saying your chance of being returned at the moment is very low because we don't do it well. But this is what we should work on, returning those after fair procedure. And then offering legal mobility. And Ukraine is a good example. If we can make it easier for people to travel, then they can even find a job. Then you can give them a work permit. Everybody benefits. But there's no right for Georgians, Ukrainians, or others to work in Germany or Poland. This is something that societies decide. But there is a right of a refugee not to be pushed into danger. That is one of the most solemn rights in the Refugee Convention and the Anti-Torture Convention. I think that's where we need that's what we need to protect.
Dziękuję, Kristian.
Okay, thank you. Kristian, you would like to say something again, so please go ahead. Kristian, voice over to you.
Thank you. Just a question. I mean, Gerald, you have dealt much more with that in research than I have. But for example, Australia, I mean, is a very stark example of trying to derail irregular migration into the country by very harsh measures. Is there actually proof that this legal construction where you say, okay, most of you, or almost most of you, will be returned, does actually stop people from coming? Because I don't know, I can't cite any evidence, but I would have my doubt that this actually changes the situation that much. I totally agree with you.
Kristian, the connection is bad again. Kristian, we are losing you. Okay.
That we have to differentiate between refugees, and it's like when there is not such a big difference.
Kristian, we don't hear you. Can you take your phone to your hand again?
It's not about the phone, it's about the connection. Sorry.
It's the connection. Okay.
I heard the first part of your question, I think.
Okay. Okay, so Gerald, you can refer to that, but very briefly, please. We have much more topics to discuss.
Well, that's a fundamental question. What is Australia doing? Let's be again clear. There is a cliche, I fear, that harsh methods don't stop irregular migration. They do. There are no boats coming to Australia since the Australians have a policy of putting everyone on 2 islands where they are treated very badly. It's just a policy that in Europe, until now, European courts in Luxembourg or Strasbourg would say are against human dignity. But it stops people. In fact, brutal methods always stop people. There are no refugees from Syria and Israel. There are many in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Turkey. But when Turkey decided to stop them and build a wall, it stopped again. So it's not that countries have no way to stop irregular migration. They do all the time. There are not that many irregular migrants in the world. There are lots of regular migrants, but most people, even those who have to flee their homes, stay in their own country because they can't get out. The problem of the borders is, who do we want to be? Do we want to be people who send soldiers to borders to shoot at people, to stop them crossing? Is that who we are? Or do we find ways to combine our belief in asylum and the human dignity with control? But Australia managed to stop people. That's why they go around the world and say, do the same that we do. And what we do in Greece today is very similar to Australia, creating conditions where people should feel that it's better to be in Afghanistan than to be in Europe. I think it's the end of the Refugee Convention if that's what we do. It's a fundamental violation of current law. It's the violation of human dignity, but it's what we do. And the number of people arriving is going down. So let's not fall for the illusion that brutality does not work. Brutality can work. The fence Israel built to Egypt has stopped people. But is this something we want to do, to have soldiers with a permission to treat irregular migrants like an enemy army or not? Currently, Europeans are not allowed to do that. And I think we should work to preserve the principle of, well, the Refugee Convention and non-refoulement. But it's an option, and that's what makes it dangerous. If the right parties, that's what Donald Trump is trying to do and has been trying to do now, just abolish the right to asylum. It happened. It happens around the world. It could happen in Europe. We are very close to it. And then what? Then this great idea of the Refugee Convention of 1951 is dead.
Dzięki. Mamy tutaj pytanie z publiczności, które...
Thank you. We've got a question from the audience, which concerns countries that migrants could be safely deported to. Between the revolution in 2010-2011, there was an issue with refugees from Tunisia. Gerald, Kristian, if Kristian is with us, would you like to refer to this question?
Yes, sorry, could you repeat that?
Before the Jasmine Revolution of 2010-2011, was there an issue with migrants from Tunisia? This is a question from the audience. I don't know which of you would like to refer to this question.
I could. There were not that many people. There was 1 year in 2011 during the revolution when tens of thousands of Tunisians left to Lampedusa. Then the Italians negotiated with Tunisia and the number went down again. This year, until the end of August, 8,000 people, Tunisian citizens, came to Europe across the sea. 8,000 in 8 months is not a dramatic number, but it was the single biggest nationality this year crossing the sea. And I would think this is a really stupid policy by Europe. What we should have with Tunisia is a policy where we have cooperation. Ideally, we offer the Tunisians what we offer Ukraine, visa-free travel, if they meet conditions, including taking back their citizens who have to leave Europe. So people don't need to get into a boat. They can travel normally with a passport. Tunisians could do that until the early 1990s. They could come to Italy without a visa. But if anybody is a criminal, if anybody stays too long, if anybody has to leave, they immediately take them back. This works with Ukraine. It works with the Balkans. It creates legal mobility, control, reduces irregular arrivals, reduces deaths. This is a smart policy. And Tunisia, per capita, is richer than Ukraine. It's much smaller and it has no war. So I think this kind of thinking of combining more mobility, but legal, with more control, also increases our security as Europeans.
Chciałabym jeszcze wrócić troszkę wcześniej.
I would like to get back to the latest 5 years of the European migrant policy. Gerald, you've been one of the authors of the migration pact between the European Union and Turkey, of the migration pact between the European Union and Turkey, and it helped to decrease the number of migrants coming to Europe via Turkey, but at the same time it was criticized by human rights organizations, which proved that Turkey is not the best place to send migrants to. And I want to ask you whether what you would do differently. Are there any aspects of the deal that you're not satisfied with?
Well, first of all, let's start at this moment before we go back. At this moment, we don't have a deal. Turkey does not take anybody back since early March, right? So right now there is no deal. What do we see? Are things better? Well, no, they are much worse. Because now the policy of the EU at the land and sea border is to push people back by force. We see this every day. It's to keep people on the islands for no reason. They will not be returned to Turkey. Turkey said it doesn't take them. They are on the islands as a signal of deterrence, to frighten people, to say, listen, this is how bad it will be if you come to Europe. I think this is really, really bad. So what's the alternative? Today, or in 2016, we proposed 3 things, 3 measures that are important. One, Turkey is the country with most refugees in the world. It's a bit funny for Europeans today when we look at how refugees are treated or asylum seekers are treated in Europe, in the EU. We look at Turkey and there are 3.5 million Syrians and they have access to school, to healthcare, to social support, funded by the EU as part of the EU-Turkey statement. 1.7 million people get every month money on a cash card. If you have a child in Turkey as a Syrian, you can send it to school, and 640,000 children go to school. This is a rate of school attendance for the school-age population similar to Syria before the war. I mean, this is an achievement. Turkey has achieved something here. Now, is everybody safe in Turkey? No, but that's why we have an asylum system. But is no Syrian safe in Turkey? Well, clearly, millions have been there for years, and they don't have a limited status. So what we suggested are three things. We suggested it in 2016, and I suggested today. We need a new statement with Turkey. Help refugees in Turkey. Give Turkey, with a huge population, 3.5 million people, give Turkey continued EU funding. They need it, the refugees need it, and Europe has an interest in the success of this integration. So put another few billion euros on the table to help this integration in Turkey. Second, take some people from Turkey and resettle them in Europe. This was the second part of the agreement. Once the flow is down, there should be a humanitarian resettlement. Point 4 of the statement from March 2016. And third, process applications of those who do come to Greece quickly, within a few weeks, which is possible if you have the will and resources, organizational. I mean, these were only 2,000 people on average, 2,500 people each month for 3 years. So this is doable. Process them quickly, and those who you can send back to Turkey, because as Syrians, they are safe there, or because as Afghans or Pakistanis, they are not found to be refugees in a fair procedure, those you can return. You reduce the number of people who come, but some people will still come. Those who need protection in Europe, they stay. Now, those three things today will reduce, but not stop, irregular migration. They will help millions of refugees in Turkey, and they will start a program of orderly resettlement. And you would not have those terrible camps on the islands. Because the only reason you have these camps on the islands when not many people arrived in the last 3.5 years is because the processing, the decisions, who should go from the island to the mainland and who should go to Turkey, this took too long. So people were stuck. But it was a political decision. It was not impossible to decide this. And today we see it. Today, nobody is going to be returned to Turkey, and we still have them on the island. So I would say this is what we need now. If anybody who criticizes this has a better idea how to persuade the Greek government or other governments in Europe of a different policy to stop what we have now, I haven't heard that a better idea in the last 4 years.
Kristian, are you here?
Kristian, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, can you say something?
I mean, I'm not commenting on the deal as such. I mean, but the thing with Turkey, the main question is Turkey safe for refugees? Is it safe for people who are returned there from Greece? I think it's. Yes, Gerald is right. For the majority of Syrians, it is safe to be in Turkey. It's not like a very positive situation, especially economically. It's not very viable for many of them to stay there indefinitely. Because what Gerald said, we should help Turkey with integration. I mean, the Turkish state as such has at least not openly declared a goal of integrating these people, also because it would have a hard time explaining this policy goal to its population. The problematic aspects, I think, come in with the domestic political situation in Turkey, which, as we all know, is one where the rule of law has, at least in some aspects, almost totally broken down, where many aspects of policy have fallen totally prey to aspirations of the president to stay in power, no matter what. And where also migrant and refugee policy are sometimes used to make other points that might be important for the president vis-a-vis Europe, but also domestically
Okay,
towards audiences.
Kristian, przepraszam, ale muszę ci jeszcze raz przerwać, bo nie
Kristian,
słyszymy.
I'm very sorry, but I have to interrupt you once again because the quality of audio is that bad that the interpreters are not able to interpret you into Polish. Do you think that you are going to have a more stable internet connection soon?
Okay.
No, probably not. Sorry, I'm very sorry for this situation. It was not foreseen. Yeah, maybe you just continue and I just keep listening, and if the situation improves, I'll jump in again.
Okej, dobrze. No to w takim
Okay, great.
kończąc ten wątek.
Okay, so putting an end to this Turkish European motive,
Jaka jest twoim zdaniem,
Gerald, what's your opinion on the future of this deal? You've said what could be done better, but if you were to summarize the most important priorities regarding the way this deal could look like in the future?
Yes, well, we have written a report in English, which is online from April this year, and it's called the Mitsotakis Plan, because we think Greece could propose this to the other EU members, because it's in Greece's interest. And I've talked to a lot of Greek ministers. I mean, it has 4 elements. We should continue to help Turkey with this huge number of refugees who are in Turkey, because it's in the interest of the refugees, it's in the interest of Europe, and it's in the interest of Turkey that their situation in Turkey and the situation of the host communities, the many municipalities around the country, which have 5%, 7% or more Syrians living there, that their situation does not deteriorate. And there is an economic crisis in Turkey. The lira has collapsed. You don't want that to become more tense. And there the EU has an interest to help. Kristian is right. The Turks don't say openly that this is an integration challenge, but everybody knows that these Syrians will not go back in any significant numbers in any near future. So having this young population learn Turkish in schools, I mean, that is the functional integration, you know, being able to operate. The EU should support it. So first pillar, put the money on the table again. Second pillar, create a functioning system with a new cutoff date. Those who are now on the islands, on the Greek islands, move them to the mainland as quickly as possible. As winter is coming, conditions are terrible. These tents are terrible. They are not protecting people from rain. There are thousands of children under the age of 12 with their parents on the islands. Bring them, accommodate them. There is money. I mean, Greece has received enough money, but you need a new agreement that from now on, if people arrive, you can host them decently, but you can also process them, their applications quickly. Now, for this, you need an organization, and I've written about this in a book recently. Unfortunately, it's in German. Which borders do we need? Welche Grenzen brauchen wir? But we've also written about it in newsletters in English. But this is possible. Process applications quickly, and those who are found to be safe in Turkey can be returned. Now, it is true, not everybody can be returned. Well, that's the idea of an asylum system. You make this determination. And thirdly, you then help Greece and you help Turkey by bringing in some refugees. And this is where the Canadian model fits in. If we would have this in some countries, we could link up preparedness to help with the need to bring recognized refugees from countries like Turkey or Greece, not to use smugglers, but to give them an orderly, a legal way. Now, if you do this, this would be possible. Of course, there is a serious problem with the rule of law in Turkey today. There are serious tensions between the EU and Turkey, even these days. So it's hard, but it's one area where you could also say where cooperation based on interests is possible. And one simple question to Europeans, I asked this in France, is, do you think Europe has more credibility when it talks about human rights in Turkey, when Turks see every day how Europe deals with migrants on its own border, where people are in terrible camps, which are worse than any camps in Pakistan, where European border guards are pushing people in little boats back to Turkey at sea, which is illegal. Our credibility to talk about human rights in Turkey, which we should, because there are people in jail in Turkey, journalists, opposition politicians, activists who should not be in jail. There is a problem of the rule of law, but our credibility is not very high if we violate our own laws visibly at the EU-Turkish border every day. So we need a system where we treat people humanely. We need cooperation based on that principle. And then we can, and we should, argue that the violations of human rights in Turkey are not acceptable for a Council of Europe member state, and are not in Turkey's interest, are not legal. But first we need some basis to cooperate, to talk. If we push people back by force, we lose all moral authority to talk about human rights issues, which is tragic, because Europe should have this moral authority.
Od jakiegoś czasu obserwujemy duży kryzys.
For some time now, we've seen a crisis in Turkish-French relationships. On Twitter, there's a huge war between the opponents of Erdogan and the opponents of Macron. If you haven't followed this, this is about Macron's plan concerning the fight against the so-called Islamist separatism after the attack against a teacher on France. But Erdogan started a diplomatic scandal calling Macron mentally insane. Gerald, do you think that this situation will influence the relations between France and Turkey? Is it a part of the game of Erdogan towards the European Union, or is it of no importance at all for our migrant topics today?
Well, it is part of a game. It's a very destructive game. It will not help Turkey. It will not help Turkish citizens. It will not help refugees. It's also bad for Europe. I mean, the reality is that we Europeans have an interest in a Turkey that is a partner, that is democratic. A Turkey like 10 years ago, when Human Rights Watch said that torture had been abolished, when you had debates in Turkey on historic topics like the Armenian genocide was openly discussed. I lived in Turkey for 7 years. I saw that at the time. And when you had minority rights improving. Now, Europe has an interest in a Turkey that is recognizing these principles. How do we get there? Well, only through cooperation. I mean, not through cooperation, clear, based on principles, but where we have common interests, we need to develop them. That's what we did before, and it worked. I have here this book by a very well-known Turkish human rights organization, the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, from 1995. At that time, human rights in Turkey, it was the heart of darkness. This book lists, dozens of people who disappeared, people who were tortured, people who were killed, journalists who were jailed. At that time, Turkey and Greece were in confrontation, military confrontation in the Aegean. Things looked very, very, very bad. And then 10 years later, that's how Der Spiegel presented Turkey, as a country of hope, a country of democratization that was attracting European investment, where people were interested in Europe. And then another 10 years later, the same paper presented Turkey again as a threat. So how do we get back to this? How do we prevent a deterioration which is in the interests of nobody? Well, here I think we need a smart policy. Of course, the language of President Erdogan is unacceptable, but let's be very clear. It is not very smart to mix everything together. To tell the Turks, where there have been a lot of terrorist attacks, by Islamists. I lived in Istanbul. I remember the big terrorist attacks in the center of Istanbul when Prime Minister Erdogan was prime minister. You know, there were these attacks in Istanbul. There were lots of attacks in the last 5 years by the Islamic State in Turkey, killing lots and lots of people. You know, Turkey has a problem with an experience of terrorism. You know, to say that somehow Turkey supports or didn't condemn this terrorist attack by this 18-year-old Chechen in France is not, you know, that's a bit strange. The debate on freedom of speech is a very sensitive one. Clearly, France has a different tradition today from all the Islamic countries around Europe. I mean, it's not only in France, it's not only in Turkey that a lot of Muslims are outraged by the idea of caricatures of the Prophet. Now, that doesn't mean that we should limit freedom of speech in Europe, but this is a sensitive issue which is not about Turkey. You know, this is an issue all around the Muslim world. Turning these two issues together to say anybody who is outraged by this is somehow then supporting Islamist terror, it really doesn't help. Let's go back to diplomacy. What do Europeans want? We don't want Turkey to threaten Greece. Clearly, we can't accept Turkey to threaten Cyprus. But how do we get out of this? Is there a win-win way to resolve the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean? My colleagues and I are writing a paper at the moment proposing one. I won't go into the details here, but Turkey is at the moment looking for gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. Gas which it might never find. Gas which, if it finds it, it might never be able to use because it's too expensive. If we could agree on a moratorium on gas exploration in the whole Eastern Mediterranean between Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus for further exploration, and the EU invests instead in alternative energy, supports this in Turkey, in Cyprus, in Greece, everybody would benefit. You know, have a green foreign policy. Turkey is a big industrial country next to Europe. It's if we care about decarbonization and climate change, we have an interest again. So find areas where we can reduce tension, where we have common interests, send a signal to the young Turks, and most Turks are below the age of 30, that Europe has principles, Europe believes in the rule of law, Europe believes in democracy and free speech. And yet, if Turkey would develop again in this direction, as it did 10 years ago, it's a member of the Council of Europe, it's a member of NATO, we could have a constructive relationship, which is also the best for Turkey to develop economically. Now, this might sound utopian today, but that's why I refer to 1995, because it sounded utopian in 1995. But at that time, the vision was there. A customs union was created with Turkey in 96, at a dark time of human rights. And it encouraged people in Turkey who believed in human rights and in Europe to push for it. Somehow we need to get out of this vicious cycle at the moment. And of course, the aggressive rhetoric by Turkey's leaders against Germany, against France, against Greece is unacceptable. But Turkey is not just the leaders. We need to send us a vision of how we envisage relationship between the two societies 10 years from now. And it should be a positive vision.
Okay, bardzo dziękuję. Jeszcze raz.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's try again to talk to Kristian. Maybe the connection is better now. Kristian, I would like to ask you the following question. What is your interpretation? Oh, I think we've lost Kristian. We've just lost Kristian. Okay, so since we've lost Kristian, I would like to address another topic. It is something you've written about in your book, Gerald, the book you've mentioned. There are many different actors. Oh, now Kristian's back. Kristian, are you there? Can you hear us? Kristian, are you there?
I just heard my name, but I didn't hear the question.
Okay, but obawiam się, że
But I'm
połączenie...
afraid the connection is still not good enough. Can you say something more so that we can test it?
Możesz powiedzieć jedno zdanie?
Yeah, I hear you well. For me, the connection seems to be working in the moment.
Okej, niestety
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you too well. So I am going to ask Gerald about his book. As I was saying, there are many actors who are becoming involved in supporting refugees. So there are big NGOs on the one hand. On the other hand, there are independent groups of activists taking initiatives too. There are European institutions, also local actors, such as the governments of certain countries or the local authorities in certain countries. And as a journalist, I visited the Balkan route in 2015, and I remember how surprised I was because there were so many conflicts between all these institutions, between all these actors. And there was a lot of mistrust between them. And small activists don't trust NGOs, NGOs don't trust the police, and so on and so on. Do you see a possibility of somehow bringing all these parties together? Because they all want to protect the rights of the refugees. So is there any possibility of bringing those people together so that they trust each other?
Well, I mean, there are really, if you simplify, two fundamental, two basic groups here, right? We have the world of NGOs, civil society, and then we have the governments. And I think we see it in the central Mediterranean, private rescue boats, for example. I mean, in Germany, people collect money, then they buy a boat, then volunteers go on the boat. You have NGOs like Doctors Without Borders supporting with medical staff. You know, you have basically private rescue boats. You see it on the Greek islands with lots of NGO initiatives. Again, doctors, but also others who want to help refugees. The problem is that these private initiatives cannot operate in the long term if governments don't allow them to operate. And we see that in the central Mediterranean with the rescue boats, and we see it now on the Greek islands. We've seen it in Hungary. I mean, human rights activists can always alert people to problems. But if a majority of the public decides that it backs the government, whatever the government does, because the only way you can stop migration is by doing what governments do, if that's the belief, then even the best journalists, even the best stories, even the best NGOs will be marginalized. I mean, that's the experience of Australia. There's no shortage of reporting by really great NGOs in Australia on how bad conditions are in those islands where Australia brings those who arrive by boat. Everybody knows now how bad conditions are. Films have been made, books have been written, but the majority of Australian politicians, government and opposition, backs the policy because the majority of the public sees no alternative. And this is where we come to the limit of civil society. Civil society needs to also, NGOs need to also find ways to propose policies that can get majority support. I mean, that's what we try to do as a think tank. Propose policies that protect human rights, but that could get government and majority support. Because only in cooperation with governments can, for example, sea rescue boats operate. What we see now is we have a lot of boats in the central Mediterranean, but if the sea rescue, the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Rome, doesn't tell these boats where the emergencies are, if the ports don't let the boats come, or if they arrive, don't let them depart, because there are some excuses that there need to be some checks, and boats are trapped for weeks, for months, they can't leave. then civil society is powerless. I mean, there can be protests in Germany, but there need to be protests in Italy, or even better, there needs to be a political debate in Italy for a policy that is better than this one. So I think the challenge, I mean, you said, can one have better coordination, less fight? The challenge lies in defining a policy that can get majority support, and that is humane. This requires governments that want to have a humane policy. It requires, then NGOs can play a huge role. I mean, you saw it in Germany. The integration of 1 million people in 1 year, I mean, who arrived within 12 months, would have been impossible without civil society. I mean, the government can say, yes, we want to do that, and it can give money, but in the end, without citizens helping voluntarily all around the country, it would not have worked. You did not have a single Moria, a single camp like Moria in Germany in 2016, nowhere, and 1 million people arrived. Everybody, they found sports places of schools to put people on, but they didn't put them in tents on a field, never, nowhere. I mean, there was an attempt to try to accommodate people. That was possible because of volunteers, because of civil society, because of activists. But the government was backing it. So in the end, that is a challenge for civil society. Criticize government, do more than government, but then governments are prepared to do. But in the end, we need to persuade majorities of citizens. If we fail at that, and I think you see it in Poland, and you saw it in Hungary, then even the best NGOs have limits to how much they can influence policy.
Tak, z pewnością to jest bardzo ważne.
For sure, this is an important problem, especially in Poland. Even the EU funds from this Asylum and Integration Fund, I don't remember the name, the Asylum and Integration Fund, I think. So we are receiving these funds, but they go to the government institutions because the ministry does not like giving these funds further to the NGOs. So we are now talking about the Mediterranean. However, migration to Europe is taking place at other borders too. And we have a comment from the audience. Someone is saying that we should be discussing also the eastern border of the European Union. And I could ask you 2 questions. So Chechnya, refugees from Chechnya coming to Poland, very often they travel further towards Western Europe, although this is not always the case. And based on the Dublin Convention, they are sent back to Poland if they do so. However, there were many controversies in the media and among NGOs when it was established that many people applying for asylum at the border between Poland and Belarus where the applications were not accepted by the border guard. They were not allowed to apply, to make an application as such. So the applications were not considered at all. And at the same time, they were not allowed to enter Poland. That situation, well, it has taken place now, and it's been taking place for many years. So this has nothing to do with the current government party in Poland. And a culmination of that happened in 2016 and 2017. And now may I ask you, Gerald, to make a few comments on this topic. Of course, there weren't so many people there as compared to the Mediterranean. However, that topic was not discussed in Europe at all. So within this European debate about refugees, even though the Polish NGOs and the NGOs from Belarus were trying to bring it up, but it was very difficult for them to make this topic an international one. So how could you comment on this?
Well, I mean, I have to, not only are you right, about this being an important neglected issue, but it also applies to me and my colleagues. We have not written about this. I only know the formal numbers of applications for asylum in Poland, which are very low and have been very low for many, many years. You don't see a 2015 crisis in Poland. It's not an increase in asylum applications that year. So I know the formal numbers. I have never been at that border, and I don't know enough about the topic. I mean, what you describe, of course, I've heard, but we've never studied it, is a classic situation of pushbacks. If people reach a border and want to apply for asylum and you push them back, I mean, this is what the Refugee Convention is supposed to prevent. But I don't know enough honestly, about what's going on there. And I would very much welcome if any Polish activists, experts, NGOs who have information on this in any language that I might read, German, English, French, please send me. It's a gap in our paper, in our work, for the simple reason that, of course, all of Europe, the big debate was on the big numbers. And the big numbers, the thousands of people dying, the hundreds of thousands arriving in 2015 were in the Mediterranean. But yes, Europe has more borders. I think one good thing about the eastern border is that with Ukraine, at least, actually, I do describe two things in my book, but they're not about this problem of the Chechens or others who need protection. It's about the miracle of Europe's borders between Germany and Poland. And then, of course, also the visa liberalization for Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. That, I think, was a very, very good European policy, right? To make it, because then people don't have to come illegally. Ukrainians don't need to come illegally with smugglers crossing. They can come visa-free. That's important. That shows that you can have more mobility and control, and that's good. But for Chechen refugees, of course, that doesn't solve any problem for them. So please do let me know more, and then let's have a debate on what you suggest. What should be the debate in Europe?
Dobrze, obiecuję wysłać raport.
Okay, I promise I will send you reports in English, reports that were published at that time concerning Chechens. And I think that this topic appeared in the European media only in relation to infamous so-called concentration camps for LGBT people from Chechnya, because it turned out that also such people were not able to come to Poland in that way, and they were evacuated from Russia by planes on the basis of agreements made with individual governments. But when it comes to working migration from Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, but also today from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Uzbekistan, because there are mutual agreements, facilitations for migrants, more and more of them, which is a kind of paradox, taking into account the radical right-wing government we have in Poland, and still each year we've got more facilitation for migrants that are introduced without any media coverage. The government does not inform about this, but certainly you've heard that at the international arena, the Polish government is trying to present this influx of working force as an influx of refugees that require help, which is horrible, because these people do not require help and do not get any help from the state. On the contrary, we've got unprecedented economic growth, and they've contributed to this growth significantly, working in our country. And I wanted to ask you about Belarus, where since August, protests have been staged, and lots of people have been fleeing this country, which is not given much coverage in European media. The Polish government has introduced an exception on the basis of which people from Belarus, despite COVID restrictions, can enter Poland without any prior permit, work permit, on the basis of the so-called humanitarian visa. But initially, they were not given access to the labor market based on this visa. Now this is changing, but still the government is talking much about this, but the help, the real help is not that huge. And I wanted to ask whether those migrants from Belarus are visible in Europe in any way, and whether if the Polish government is still treating them in this very unclear way. Is this possible that people from Belarus will go from Poland to west of Europe?
Well, there are two interesting points that are raised by what you've just said. I mean, one is that Poland, like other countries in the European Union, policymakers know that they have a labor shortage over the next 10 years. I mean, there are all these studies somewhere in the labor ministries or in the economic ministries that project what labor force will be missing if you want to keep developing, keep having growth. There need to be migrants. Now, this is separate from refugees. The refugee debate is not about being useful, it's about protecting people who are in danger. But it is, of course, linked to migration. Germany, Poland, all of our societies, Romania, any society that develops economically will need migrants. And so it's not surprising that also this government in Poland, although it doesn't talk about it much, welcomes migrants into the labor market. The question then is, and this is a different debate, is how you make a success of this and what rights migrants should have. It's separate from the refugee debate, but it is a debate of human rights. Of course, that matters also. But it's interesting, and that's the second issue I think you raised in the context of Belarus. It's very interesting how important, and it's not surprising, how important it is how a society regards those who come. If a group is seen as people who deserve help, because a society understands what happens to them, there's sympathy for them. People can understand, they see the repression, they see what's happening, they see the courageous citizens, the women of Belarus in the streets protesting. They know from their own experience what it means to be treated like this by the state from the past. And then they feel sympathy. Then governments can, with much more ease, be generous. And when the Hungarians fled hundreds of thousands in 1956, they fled Hungary, they went to Austria, hundreds of thousands of people after the Soviet troops and the Warsaw Pact troops went into Hungary. A lot of countries around the Western world were able to pick them up, to help them, to bring them to Canada, to Australia, to the United States, because there was a lot of sympathy. And the same was there for the Vietnamese boat people. So this is actually a fundamental point. I think it's very good for Poland. And I think if a large number of people from Belarus would flee to the EU, there would be many countries in the EU that would say, we need to help. There is, in Germany, people are aware of what's happening in Belarus. People are wondering, they see on the media, it's right that the Sakharov Prize this year, the Human Rights Prize in the European Parliament was given to the protesters in Belarus. I think if there will be, let's hope it will not happen, but if there will be further repression and 100,000 people flee or more, like in Hungary in 1956, I hope, but I also believe that because of the image of this protest movement, many European countries will not turn them away. And I think this is also, I from what you say and from what I've heard, I think Poland will be in this group of countries that will say, like the Baltic states, like Germany, like Scandinavia. This is a group of people we really need to help. And unfortunately, you know, I've been very skeptical. I lived in Ukraine when I was young. I was working there for a year at university. I've been going to Ukraine a lot, Moldova, Georgia. And my experience in this part of the world is that, you know, once Russia decides that it will give any backing it needed to the dictator, to Lukashenko, you know, once the Kremlin has decided, it is like Hungary 1956 or the Czechoslovakia 1968. You can have all the public be against the regime. The regime, because it's backed by Moscow, will use any brutality. So the real way to stop this brutality is to threaten Moscow. I've been proposing here in Berlin to say, use, you know, the pipeline Nord Stream 2 as a tool. Say you suspend construction. And if there is repression in Belarus, it stops. At least in that way, if the repression stops in Belarus, you get something meaningful, because the target for sanctions needs to be Moscow. It's not Lukashenko. Lukashenko has every interest to be brutal. It's his political survival. It's the Kremlin that is behind it. But if this doesn't change, if the Kremlin backs up the security apparatus in Minsk, I fear that we will have many refugees come to Europe. And I hope, and I am actually not pessimistic on this, that they will be received as Hungarians or Czechs and Slovaks were in the past, fleeing from communist regimes, that they will be received with open arms, or at least not turned back.
To teraz ostatnie pytanie.
The very last question. Well, it seems that it's not particularly related to the topic, but when I'm sitting at my desk in office, I cannot stop to think about what's going on in the streets all around Poland. There are protests which are most violent since 1989, and they have to do with the ruling of the quasi-independent constitutional court in Poland, which said that termination of pregnancy due to some severe defects of the fetus is against the Polish constitution, which faced great protests from the majority of the society. What is your opinion? Forcing women to give birth to children which have some lethal defects, isn't it against the Geneva Convention? And can Polish women count on asylum in other parts of the world?
Well, I'm not an expert on how asylum law applies to this. I mean, I don't know. I've been following Poland very intensely the last few years, and we've published a few reports on the issue of the rule of law. I mean, and I think in a strange way, of course, if a majority of Polish society and a lot of very motivated women, but also men of a younger generation, want to protest and will protest, in the end, I think they will succeed. I mean, there's been a movement towards recognizing the right to abortion, even in Ireland. I mean, very Catholic countries, Spain, Ireland, Italy. It would be strange to see Poland outside of this for long. But there is the other issue that I know more about, which is the rule of law. And there I think the situation is very, very worrying, because you now have a system in Poland where a minister of justice has so much power over prosecutors and judges. And of course, in order to have a democratic debate in a society, you need the protection of independent courts, so that, you know, when you protest, you don't need to worry that there will be political justice against you. You know, when you speak out, you don't need to worry as a businessman, as an activist, as a lawyer, as a politician, as a citizen, that the courts protect you. And so, I mean, I'm watching these protests on abortion. What I see in the background, what I follow every day, is the debate in Europe on the rule of law. And we've made a proposal where we said, and I think this is especially important. I mean, it's mainly important at this moment for Poland, where we say that if the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, the highest court in the EU, if it rules that in a country some legal mechanisms in the judicial system undermine the independence of courts, that Article 19 of the EU Treaty, Article 19 says that there should be independent justice all over the EU. This is a condition for the EU integration, is that courts everywhere are also EU courts because they apply EU law. And they need to be independent. They can't be controlled by the executive. If this is violated, and if the European Court finds that there is a violation, then the government must accept and implement the EU Court's ruling. And if it doesn't, all EU funding should stop until it does. So the goal is, this is a sanction that should be so strong that no government will ever dare to ignore an Article 19 ruling by the highest court in the EU. Now that's what I've been trying to push, and because the credibility of courts around Europe is also essential to keep the European Union. You know, if there's a sense in other countries, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Norway, that Polish courts are not independent, that the judgments might be influenced by the executive, then the judgments will not be trusted. And then the EU falls apart from within. So I think on the abortion issue, that is a political issue where in all societies I've seen, the trend has been very clear because of public pressure towards more recognition of women's rights and towards recognizing the right to abortion. So I would be surprised if Poland really can move in the other direction. But the rule of law, I worry if you weaken the rule of law, if you have a system where a minister of justice controls everyone, can discipline and frighten and every judge and controls every prosecutor, then nobody is safe. And then the kinds of protests that you need, the kinds of public debate you need, becomes harder. You know, I've just been attacked in Hungary as an enemy of the state. I sit in Berlin, we write reports. But as long as, you know, the government can say this, the media can write this. But if judges and prosecutors are controlled by the government, and if you are Hungarian or if you're a Pole and you're critical, and you have no independent courts to protect you, then even your activism on issues like abortion or any issue, it becomes, you should not need the courage of a dissident in a democracy to be critical and to demonstrate and to go and protest. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Now our time is up, so we have to stop now. I am afraid that at the moment the Minister of Justice has power even over Jarosław Kaczyński, which means a lot. So thank you very much, Gerald Knaus, and thank you, Kristian, as well, for all he has managed to say during the debate, despite the bad connection. I also want to thank the audience for the questions and the Heinrich Böll Foundation.